Okay, so this is the final part of Chapter 6, and the second part of that discussion of the criminal justice system, which, as I explained in the first part, is largely looking at the criminal justice system using the conflict perspective. Um, that particular perspective. There are other ways you can approach studying the criminal justice system if you were to approach it as a functionalist or as a symbolic interactionist, interested in specifically on, how people within the criminal justice system see themselves or see each other or interact with one another. But there is certainly a tendency for the conflict theoretical perspective to loom large in the kind of sociological study of the criminal justice system because of the types of questions that the conflict perspective asks about objectivity and bias and inequalities. And so we started down that path the latter half of the last presentation, and we will be picking back up where we left off. So the end of the last presentation really emphasized the fact that there seem to be some disparities in the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment, as well as who is over and underrepresented in the prison population versus the larger population. Now, of course, the fact that some people are groups of people based on age, education, race, gender are over underrepresented would not necessarily be more problematic if maybe those groups of people just commit more crimes. And that is kind of the question that sociologically we need to answer, right? Because the conflict theorists would suggest that you can't just look at their overrepresentation in the prison population and automatically come to that conclusion, given the fact that if you look at that criminal justice system flowchart, you can see that there are several points of departure that allow people who perhaps have committed a crime or at least been accused of committing a crime of kind of exiting the system without ever spending a day in jail. So you don't necessarily want to assume that just because more of a certain type of person is in prison, be it race, age, or gender, that necessarily means that they necessarily commit more of a specific type of crime. But how do we answer that question? Because as I said before, we don't have great data on who commits crimes. Once we kind of find out that someone has committed a crime, it's been observed, it's been reported, that's not necessarily 100% of the crimes that are being committed, especially for property related crimes or drug related crimes, or really almost any crime with the exception of murder, because of the presence of a dead body. Usually we do a pretty good job of at least knowing when murder is committed, but pretty much every other type of crime is probably underreported, and therefore we don't know a lot about. So if you are a sociologist, and particularly if you're a conflict theorist, how do you go about, or you're approaching this from the conflict perspective, how do you go about answering this question? What type of information would you need to kind of help substantiate your idea that people who are overrepresented in prison aren't necessarily there just because they commit more of that type of crime. So I am going to walk you through a specific way in which maybe a conflict theorist would approach this question in regards to a particular form of crime, and that's drug use. And emphasize the fact that for sociologists to try to answer this question, the key is trying to think of other types of data sources you can use outside of the ones that exist as part of the kind of criminal justice system, because those particular statistics, that particular data largely reflects who's been caught, who's been arrested, and if you're trying to ask a question about is that biased or not, then obviously you can't use the data to prove that point. So we're going to begin off by, who is committing crimes. So the reason why it's particularly useful to use kind of drug convictions as an example for this is because we do collect large scale data about drug use. The CDC, as well as other kind of government institutes, as well as educational institutes, they collect data on people's drug usage. And so this is a graph that just kind of plots the difference between those terms. So when we look at who in a self-report admits to using illicit drugs, so illegal drugs, and versus who is incarcerated for drug use, you can kind of see that these two things don't necessarily correlate. That when we look at who's most likely to use, we see that white men admitted 42% said that they had used illicit drugs in their lifetime, 39% of black men, 34% of white women, 32% of Hispanic men, 25% of black women, and 19% of Hispanic women. So that's what the self-reports say. But then when we look at who's incarcerated for drug use, black men are overwhelmingly more likely to be incarcerated. And much more so than white men and white women, who are the kind of next of the largest group of users. And then Hispanic men come next with drug use. And that raises questions about, especially with something for drug use, who gets caught and how and why. So this isn't for selling drugs, just for drug use. How would someone be caught if they were using drugs? For people who study this is where the role of profiling can kind of come into play, right? The idea that whether you are driving or you are jaywalking or just walking down the street, this sense of who gets stopped, and why, that in terms of looking suspicious or seeming like they're out of place or behaving in a suspicious manner. All of that, of course, opens you up for a potential search. And if you are searched and you have drugs on you, then this, of course, can lead to an arrest and a conviction for drug use. This is where oftentimes social class comes into play. So the difference between being a poor drug user versus a rich drug user, that has a lot to do with whether or not you're doing drugs in a public place, like on a street corner or in a public park, versus whether or not you're doing drugs in your own home, which the likelihood of the police just showing up and knocking on your door is admittedly very unlikely. And then, of course, after you've been caught, once again, we've already discussed, police have some discretion, especially with something like a drug use charge. Once again, this is not selling. So who then gets arrested versus who gets a warning, who gets a slap on the wrist. There are racial and gender implications of that. And then, of course, that same question, who, how, why, repeats at each level. Does your case go to trial? Does the prosecutor decide to charge you? Does the judge throw out your case? What type of sentence do you receive? And so there is the potential, that biases will happen at each level, so that by the time we reach the actual incarceration level, what we have is this kind of like stark disparity between who is now incarcerated for something like drug use versus what the self-report data said that, a good number of adults admit to doing illicit drugs, but yet most of them do not, in fact, wind up in jail for it. Now, of course, self-reports, although this is a very popular form of data, does come with some drawbacks. So maybe some people, based on race, based on gender, are less likely to be fully honest on a questionnaire, even if it's promised that it's anonymous. This is where, as a sociologist, you want to try to think, okay, is there additional data out there besides the arrest and the conviction statistics, and besides self-reports, is there more objective data? So this particular chart, which is the National Longitudinal Study of Youth, it is self-report data. You see, it's looking at blacks and whites, seniors that report drug use. But what I really want you to focus on is the kind of small graph that's up in the corner, because this is emergency room visits. And if you think about why someone would be admitted to the emergency room related to drug usage, it has a lot to do with, of course, overdosing or fear of overdosing. And while health insurance could come into play here, it's worth noting that an ER visit, they are not allowed to turn you away regardless of health insurance, which is why we use ER visits and not necessarily something like checking yourself into a rehab center, where that type of behavior is going to be a lot more closely correlated to social class, and therefore also is going to kind of reflect who's more likely to be wealthy in our society, which is whites as opposed to blacks. But ER visits are a much more objective data source than self-reports. And what you see between 1994 and 2000 is that African American seniors were a lot less likely to go to the emergency room for a drug-related visit than white seniors. And then you can see that, especially in the 1998 onward, you see that sharp uptick in white seniors. And of course, what we now know is this is related to the beginning of the opioid epidemic, which has ravaged white communities and young white people at much higher rates than it has at African Americans. So this kind of holds up here. So, in addition to the self-report data, this is, for sociologists, a kind of additional source to suggest that if you looked at who is arrested for drugs and convicted of drug usage, you would expect to see maybe much more similar patterns in terms of ER visits related to overdose. But instead, what you seem to see is there is a racial disparity suggesting that white teenagers are more likely to be admitted to the ER for drug-related overdose, even though, once again, we don't then in fact see that in arrests. So people are going to the hospital for overdosing, but not necessarily being arrested in similar rates for drugs. And then a final kind of objective source, especially if you're in New York City, would be if you have some good data around stops, even stops that don't result in arrest. So, New York City, at one point in time, they had a policy that was pretty controversial at the time, because people felt like that it perhaps violated people's Fourth Amendment rights around like illegal search and seizures. And it was their stop and frisk policy, which largely meant that a police officer could pretty much stop and frisk you with very little cause. And so the policy was later, under their kind of most recent mayor, has been has been terminated. But we have the data back when it was going on from 2004 to 2012, about who was most likely to be stopped, as well as what the result of that stop was. So what you see here is the number of stops before a successful seizure. So the lower the number, the better the policing, in the sense that they only had to stop so many of those people before they found a basically good reason for stopping someone. They were seized either guns or drugs or other weapons. And so stops per seizure for blacks is 143, for Hispanics it's 99, and for whites it's 27. And so if you're looking at it, 143 stops before you have a successful seizure is just a dismal rate. It literally means you inconvenienced and harassed 143 citizens who were doing nothing wrong, and you found nothing. 27 is not a bad number. It is literally almost a 25% success rate. And it was this data was part of what was used to make the successful argument as to why the policy should be overturned. Because if what the policy was encouraging police to do was largely to racially profile, and that wasn't resulting in there being successful seizures, then this isn't the type of good community policing that encourages mutual kind of respect and the kind of the type of working together that communities need to do with the police, especially low-income communities, in order to have successful community policing. If instead, if race wasn't a part of it, which you would think, what else could you look for to determine that maybe somebody has a gun, or maybe somebody has another weapon, or maybe someone has drugs on them? So if you took race off the table and instead you looked at things like behavior and how people were responding, and does that look like if it's not necessarily related to a person's race, then this increases the success of the policy, or the success of the stop. So once again, just suggesting that not necessarily that the people that are locked up for drug related crimes did not commit those crimes. For social conflict theorists, the question they want to really ask is, but if we know that other people are committing those crimes and they're not locked up, what types of questions should we ask around that? Why aren't they locked up? How does it impact people's kind of trust and faith in the criminal justice system if they aren't necessarily sure that all crime is being investigated and prosecuted fairly? And so that type of question around fairness, it doesn't just exist around arrest and convictions. A lot of conflict theorists are also extremely interested in what those disparities look like when it comes to something like sentencing. So they're kind of two different focuses I'm going to kind of highlight here that sociologists have kind of contributed to the study of sentencing disparities. Part of it, of course, having once again to do with drugs, and especially drugs that are associated with the poor. And then the other one being the death penalty. And we're going to start off by talking about the death penalty. So it notes here that the death penalty, which we also call capital punishment, is a possible punishment if you commit a capital crime, a crime such as murder or treason, which we feel is severe enough to merit the death penalty. And at the federal government, there are at least 41 offenses that are listed as being punishable by death. But the death penalty, which we have had in America really since our onset, has become controversial over the last few decades. And at least one of the contributing factors to that controversy has been the role that exoneration by DNA evidence has played. So as our DNA technologies has gotten better and stronger, since 1989, at least 311 people have been found innocent. And once again, we see a bit of a disparity there between 193 of them were black, 94 were white, and 22 were Hispanic. And that's because before we had strong DNA evidence, prosecutors presented their case and you were decided upon by a jury of your peers. But what we can tell as sociologists when we look at the data is that this process was not necessarily objective. Your likelihood to receive the death penalty, first of all, is dramatically impacted by your gender. 99.1% of capital punishment convictions are given to men versus only 0.9% being given to women. When we look at the race of the defendant, African Americans are once again are overrepresented, 35% versus their 13% of the populations. Whites are slightly underrepresented at 56 to 64. But what also seems to quite matter is, who your victim was. If your victim was white, that dramatically increased the likelihood that you would receive the capital punishment, which isn't to say that Latinos and black victims don't exist, but they make up less than about 20% of the victims that in cases that received the capital punishment since the 1970s. And once again, just because, this is a decision that is made by lots of people who are imperfect, people that from the prosecution to the judge to the juries. So it's not necessarily like this practice is kind of applied equally and fairly, which makes it unsurprising then that once we had a way of being more objective in our approach, i.e., DNA evidence, that the exoneration rates are what they are, that there are racial implications of people that were kind of unfairly convicted. And of course, as students always point out, you know, that's just the 311 people who were found innocent because they were in fact alive and still on death row. We don't posthumously check DNA. So, before we had the ability to collect DNA evidence, analyze DNA evidence, all that time that we spent as a country practicing capital punishment, of course, we can't feel confident and we shouldn't feel confident that we necessarily practice this perfectly. And, what can you really offer someone or someone's family if you have already, of course, put them to death for a crime that they perhaps did not commit? And in in the context of all this controversy, it's just worth noting that a lot of countries, don't use it. Very few democratic states use capital punishment, and the ones that do use it extremely infrequently. The countries that practice it the most frequently include, besides the United States, China, Iran, North Korea, and Yemen. Not exactly the greatest company we're keeping there, and it's worth noting for the states that have it. Not all states that have it regularly use it. So what you see here is a map of, the states that have the number of executions they've had during the kind of post 1980s era. And so what you can see is the states in pink, the ones that actually have the death penalty as an option. A lot of states rarely practice it. You have Oregon with 2, Wyoming with 1, Colorado with 1. And then you have states that don't have it at all anymore. And those are the states in purple that have passed state statutes that have prohibited its use. And then you have states that, while they have it, they have not executed anyone, and that's Kansas and New Hampshire and Rhode Island. But then part of why the United States is one of those countries that is on the frequent use execution list is because we do have states that more readily use it than a lot of other states, of which, of course, Texas being a kind of key standout at 518, which is a lot more than pretty much almost all the other states, combined. And so it will be interesting to see moving forward, if because DNA technology has gotten better and stronger and we can more confidently, say this person committed that crime, is that going to encourage other states to perhaps utilize the death penalty more? Or as more and more advocates have spoken up about, the not taking a life, whether or not putting someone to death by lethal injection, which is how a lot of states currently do the practice, whether or not it is in fact cruel and unusual. There have been some cases where people have had very bad reactions to the drugs, and that those cases have gone as far as to the Supreme Court, trying to determine, is this going to be a practice that the U.S. is going to continue? But for sociologists, right, the other question is if we don't put people to death, but we are still a country that's kind of committed to this retribution style of punishment. Well, what's the other option? Because in addition to being a country that utilizes the capital punishment, much more so than most other democratic nations, we also incarcerate more of our citizens than any other nation on earth. So you can kind of see that the country that's closest to us in terms of incarcerations per 100,000 people is Cuba. And I really want to note this per 100,000 because sometimes students get really confused about how rates work. It doesn't matter if the United States is a more populous country, although it's worth noting that we're not more populous than China, who you can see incarcerates far less of its citizens than we do. Rates is the great equalizer because we're interested in the number per 100,000. And that per 100,000 doesn't really vary depending on whether or not you're talking about a tiny country or a much larger country. So we incarcerate a little under 700 per 100,000 people in our country. So this kind of large number of people that are incarcerated raises up the other kind of questions around sentencing and sentencing disparity, which also brings us to just the history part of this presentation, where we talk about why do we imprison so many people in the first place. So it's worth noting that we in our country dramatically started to imprison more people after the 1970s, and especially the time period between the 1980s and the 2000s. And we call that time period the prison boom. And 2009 was kind of the peak of incarceration, where we had, a lot of federal and state prisoners in our system. So historically, why did we have a prison boom? Was it because of rising crime rates? Well, the fancy answer there is no. Overall, crime rates have remained about the same, and actually, at some periods during the prison boom, it actually decreased. There was a period between 1980 and 1996 that, some of it was driven by an increase in crime rates, but a lot of it was driven by changes in sentencing policy. And the reason why we had changes in sentencing policy had a lot more to do with politics and political campaign promises than it had to do with actual kind of increases across the board, across the country in crime. So crime is one of those things that today a lot of Americans list as being a serious problem or a serious concern. But during the 1960s, most Americans did not even list crime as being the nation's most pressing concern. the Republican Party, beginning in 1964 with Barry Goldwater's campaign, a lot of that which was based around kind of being anti-integration and civil rights, focused on crime as a central issue. And kind of from that moment on, crime kind of became a political football between the two major political parties of Democrats and Republicans, with both sides wanting to kind of position themselves as being tough on crime, pro safety, because those are great slogans and it sounds great. And we saw this pop up in multiple political campaigns. A good example of one very successful campaign was George H.W. Bush, who, when he was running against Michael Dukakis, he released the infamous Willie Horton ad, which, if you've never heard about that ad, I suggest clicking on that link and reading a little bit more about it. But Willie Horton was a state prisoner who, back when they used to give weekend prison passes, he committed a murder while he was on a weekend prison pass. And Michael Dukakis, who's the governor of that state, George H.W. Bush was able to kind of successfully link the Willie Horton incident to him, and beat him pretty soundly. You can see some stills from that ad, and you can see how it really kind of played on people's fears around crime, and this idea, on one hand, you have someone that's stern and tough and supports the death penalty, and on this other hand, you have someone that is being accused of supporting weekend prison passes, which was seen as lenient and potentially dangerous. Um, and so, as more and more politicians at both the federal, state, and local levels kind of campaigned on these promises about keeping people safe and being hard on criminals, what we started to see in the 90s was a rise in what we call severe sentencing. This is where a lot of states were encouraged by the federal government to pass mandatory minimum sentences. So instead of the judge having a more discretion about how to sentence people for certain crimes, there started to be these mandatory minimums. Several states passed the controversial three strikes laws, where if you were convicted of two felonies, then by that third strike, it really didn't matter the level of the crime being committed. It came with a mandatory, extremely long sentence. And so this is how people who, perhaps they stole something and then stole something else, but then had a very maybe minor, I don't know, maybe even jaywalking type of a final strike. It could lead to them being very desperate and engaging in kind of criminally desperate behavior, but that contributed to our kind of prison boom. And the Willie Horton case, it made state politicians, local politicians very fearful about, that type of thing happening on their watch. So, in addition to weekend passes pretty much being totally eliminated. In most states, what you saw is parole became extremely limited, and in some cases was even abolished. So all of that meant that you had people that were getting jail sentences that maybe they wouldn't have gotten in the past, people getting much lengthier jail sentences than what they would have gotten in past, and then them having to serve out those sentences more fully or fully than what they would have maybe had to do in the past. So when you look at something like this chart about like how in 2009, how so many, what percentage of the population was imprisoned at that time, all of those things contributed to that. Particularly, I want to highlight kind of the role that the drug war played here, because it's worth noting that a lot of these, especially in the 90s, a lot of these convictions were not related to violent crimes, but instead came from drug crimes. And so, even though drug use decreased, drug arrest increased, particularly as the data supports for blacks and Puerto Ricans. And so this war on drugs is a significant contributor to kind of that disparity behind bars. One policy that has since been uh, has been abolished, but certainly existed for most of the 90s and the early aughts was what we call the crack cocaine sentencing disparity. So basically, in order to receive the same amount of years for a sentence, a person would need to have 100 times the amount of cocaine as they would crack. And a lot of that had to do with the kind of correlation with crack being with poverty, poor minorities, and cocaine in the 80s and 90s largely being seen as like a wealthy kind of party drug. And so you can see that even in media examples. So if you ever watch the movie or the TV show The Wire, or the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, they kind of illustrate who the kind of prototypical crack user versus cocaine user was. So 5 grams of crack cocaine would get you a mandatory 5-year sentence, and this was certainly contributed to kind of that boom in African American male drug conviction rates during that time. But in order to receive a 5-year sentence for cocaine, you would need to have 500 grams. And just think about how unlikely that would. Like, I mean, you would basically be like Al Pacino and Scarface. For the most part, if you're not a dealer, you aren't going to have 500 grams of cocaine on you. So very few people got that kind of mandatory 5-year sentence for coke. And if you had lower than that, then that allowed you to kind of be able to plea out of the system. And there was, of course, both race as well as class implications of who this then impacted and who this did not impact. And so finally, as we kind of like move out of this discussion of disparities, just in general, because we incarcerate so many of our citizens, and because a lot of the citizens that we incarcerate are not necessarily in jail for violent related crimes, what is the cost? What do we lose? Well, as I mentioned before, if you think about the four functions of punishment: retribution, social protection, rehabilitation, and deterrence. We can certainly say that it's not working in terms of rehabilitation or deterrence because we can look at the recidivism rates. We can see that the number of people who go back to prison after they are arrested, and sometimes it's just months after their release, and that the rearrest rates, especially for a lot of the property crimes, car theft, burglary, illegal weapons, a lot of those are really high, as opposed to even like the violence recidivism rates, which, while not as high, are still fairly high. All of that just kind of lending some credibility to this argument of, if jail isn't making society safer, if it's not deterring people from committing these types of crimes, and it's not making people better, is it in fact money well spent? And so it is extremely expensive. Our kind of mass incarceration system, it costs approximately $30,000 per year to incarcerate one person. This results in over $60 billion annually. For a lot of states, although they have not spent as much money increasing the funding towards education, both lower and higher education, the increasing amounts of monies that they have spent on corrections has been quadruple what they've spent on education. And so certainly, once again, going back to that point from chapter 1, not all sociologists are reformists, right? Some people, they collect the data, they report, they analyze it, and they report what they find. And the numbers are important because it's the numbers that make this not just opinion, but statistical fact. But for sociologists who are in fact reformers, there is this sense of, okay, and once we have this information, what is it that we want to do with it? What is it that we want to accomplish? How do we want to influence policy? And so, one place where you will find a lot of sociologists is in the world of criminal justice reform. And so, if you have seen or read anything in the news about people talking about ending prisons, or what they call the prison abolishment, the prison abolishment movement. This is something that certainly some sociologists that study criminal justice support, largely because of what they feel like are the kind of inherent disparities that exist within the system, as well as just kind of the inefficiencies that are there. And so that is kind of the conflict perspective, particularly on the criminal justice system.